All right, and welcome back to another episode of Who's Lifting Today. Today, we're going to talk about should you lift with your kids? We're going to talk about the pros, talk about the cons. I want to give a little bit of backstory, actually, because I actually used to uh, train kids. My youngest client ever was 7 years old. I've trained rep sports teams as young as like 10. So I had like a bunch of like 10 to 20 10-year-olds who all trained together. I've done it in group settings. I have trained kids one-on-one for kids who either for their sport or they just want to, it was a healthy activity for them to do. And there's a lot of misconceptions about lifting with kids and whether it's safe, whether it's something that you should do with your kids. I've worked with a lot of moms who, their kid sees that their mom is lifting weights. And so they're like, well, they mimic the mom. It's like very common. Maybe they want to have that as like a family activity, or maybe they just want to, know that, hey, if my kid like finds the dumbbells in the basement, like, is it okay if he plays around with them? And we're going to kind of talk about like the pros, the cons. But I think the first thing that we need to do is talk about some myths that are very common. They're talked about a lot. I had these questions asked to me when I was training from the parents, when I was training their kids. These were things they were concerned about. So we're going to kind of talk about that today and go from there. So the first one is lifting is unsafe for children. This is like a really common belief that exists among a lot of parents, and they're very concerned if their kids lift too early in life. There's not a lot of data to support this. And actually, there's data that goes the opposite route, where in other countries, there are literally like 6-year-old weightlifters, and they grow up to be perfectly fine with like no added issues. You can train kids at a very young age. There's a lot of like weightlifting teams in like more Eastern countries that they start training at like 6 years old, like lifting weights, like Olympic lifting weights. And it's, they don't run into problems later. And the idea that lifting is unsafe for kids, I think, comes from this idea that like lifting is unsafe in general, and then it's like even worse for kids is like the idea. But that doesn't seem to be true. We have a lot of data actually support that it's good for kids, and there's actually a lot of benefits, which we're going to talk about later in this podcast episode. The second is that it stunts their growth. There's like no data to support this. This is like an idea that's come around. For the most part, if you live in like a first world country and there's nothing like wrong with your child, there's no like condition or disease, most people grow to the height that they're supposed to, like plus or minus like half an inch. Lifting weights doesn't change this at all. They've done studies where they've compared like kids who lift weights and like their potential height to other kids who didn't lift weights. It doesn't seem to be the case that like lifting stunts their growth. We have like no reason to believe that. A third one that exists as well is that injury happens a lot with kids. Again, not a lot of data on this. When kids do get injured, it is because they're doing something that they can't do from a technical standpoint, or no one taught them properly, or they just like did something dumb, like a kid threw a dumbbell at another kid and they got injured. But it's not like the kid lifted too heavy and they got hurt that way. Like that's pretty rare, and it's about the same rate as like with adults, as an example. Which is good. And I think like when you think about it, kids lift weights now. They just don't lift weights in the gym. They lift backpacks, they lift furniture, they like move their toys around and chairs and things like that. And like that's all lifting. It's not like, if we put weight into a dumbbell form that it becomes unsafe. So of those myths, I wouldn't be concerned at all. If you're worried that it's something that your kid like shouldn't do for their age. Maybe there's a conversation about like your kid is so young that they couldn't get the form correct, or you couldn't teach them the form correctly. We're going to kind of talk about how to teach kids as well. But there's no like reason why kids shouldn't be able to lift weights in the same way that like kids can do other things in life, and other physical activity is fine. And so is like lifting weights for kids. So just wanted to cross that off first, because I know there's a lot of myths and concerns. And if you do have further questions about that, again, you can send me an email, strongwithmark@gmail.com, or my Instagram @trainingstrongwomen, if you want like further clarification on that. And I can like send you studies and all that kind of jazz, and we can have that conversation. Now, I think like the bigger question that I want to talk about here is, should you live with your kids? And there's pros and cons to this. So I'm not going to come out here and say like you definitely should or definitely shouldn't, because there is reasons to and reasons not to. And we're going to have to talk about what those reasons are. So the pro of this is that it's family time. You get to spend time with your kids. So instead of like going to play soccer or going to the park, this could be like an activity that you do. If you are, living in an area that is cold. I'm Canadian and it gets cold here. So maybe going to the park is not something you want to do with your kids because it just gets really cold here. But maybe you could lift weights in the basement instead. So it's kind of like a family time that exists. It has a lot of benefits that other sports do. So like we see benefits to putting your kids into soccer and basketball and things like that. And lifting weights is shown to like help them become more active, improve like athleticism, not in a way that's like making them into a professional athlete one day, but helps them to become more fit. And then kind of like with regular sports is that if a kid is active at a young age and stays active, it's more likely that they'll be active later in life. And so this could just be yet another thing that they're doing to keep them active and motivated. And if you want them to have physical activity in their life for the rest of their life, adding this into their life should benefit that. The third one is that you get to be an example to your kids. And I think this is like an underrated reason. So I worked with a woman named Elizabeth, badass lifter Elizabeth, and she would work out with her daughter Kai for most of her workouts. That was just kind of like a family time they had together. Kai thought it was really cool that she could like lift weights with her mom and started mimicking her mom, and it was pretty cute and really was able to set an example. And I thought that was like a really cool thing that, Kai's going to grow up thinking that like women lift weights, women are strong, women can do what they want to do. And I think that's cool that like she's going to have that example at like a young age, and that she's going to be able to, believe that she can enter that domain later in life, which I don't think is very common for women right now. It's not common in adults, let alone common in kids. It's even more uncommon in kids. So I think that's cool that you can kind of set an example for your kids. So that's the pro side. That's like the benefits to lifting with your kids. And now we can talk about the cons. So for a lot of moms that I work with, lifting is really like their own personal time. It's really a time they make for themselves, time away from the rest of their issues or whatever might come up. And that gets taken away if this becomes like a family activity. So that's something to keep in mind, is that like if training for you is like 30 minutes to yourself, kind of like your own self-care, your own like mental space where you can just focus on you, lifting with your kids is probably not the thing you want to do here. The second is the more kids that you involve, the harder it is to manage. So speaking from personal experience, the one-on-one training sessions with like a 9-year-old that I was working with was way easier to manage than like a team of kids. And basically like the more kids that you have, the harder it is to keep it organized, keep it under control, like make sure no one's, not doing anything stupid, etc. So you want to make sure that like if you have a lot of kids, it's going to be harder to keep track of them, kind of like with any activity, but especially, and you don't want like, like I said, lifting for kids, it's not like unsafe, but that doesn't mean that they're not going to do something stupid with the weights. So that's something to like keep in mind. The third thing, and I feel like a lot of this is like not going to be new to like anyone who's a parent with young kids, but I wanted to go over the cons anyways, is kids don't always want to do the exercises you want them to do, okay? They see something else, they want to do that, they get focused on that thing, they don't want to do your thing. That's something to keep in mind. And again, a lot of this might come down to like your independent child. If you feel like you can, manage what the kid wants to do in a respectable way, then absolutely, involve them. But if you find that like my kid gets distracted, it's hard enough to get them to focus on one thing. The idea that I would do that in like a weight fashion, I think is like problematic. Or not problematic, but maybe you're not comfortable with that, and that's totally fine too. So again, these are the reasons why you should and shouldn't. I'm not here to say like definitely do it or definitely don't do it. You need to gauge like the relationship with your kid, how old your kid is, like how many kids you have, like do you want to involve all of them or some of them, and like, or do you want to just make this like your own time? Like there really is no right or wrong answer. I think you just need to gauge your life and figure out is this right for you? And so there are pros and cons to it, but those are like the big three each for both pros and cons. Now, let's say you're down. You're like, this sounds really fun. Let's go for it. Let's involve them. How do we do this? Like, do we just treat them the same as adults? Do we treat them the same as any other training style? And the answer is no. There's a few reasons why kids are different than adults. So if I work with, 35-year-old mom as an example, like I can give you sets, reps, exercises. I can say, hey, 3 sets of 10, goblet squat, do that and you'll do it. Kids don't do that. Okay. If I go to an 8-year-old and they're going to be like, okay, I want you to do 3 sets of 10 of goblet squatting. Okay. And I want you to rest 60 seconds in between to make sure that you're ready for the next set, or, take more time if you need it. Like this 8-year-old's like, first of all, they're like not going to do it. They're going to get distracted. They're definitely going to get distracted if there's like more than one kid who's there. This is unrealistic. And I think it's like, if you want to work out with your kids, you really just got to make it into a game. I've seen things where like kids will carry dumbbells from one bench to the other. They'll like squat to a song as an example, or like a good one is training for time. So instead of saying, do 10 reps, you'll say, okay, I want you to keep squatting for 30 seconds in a row, and they'll just do as many squats as they can, and they'll slow down when they get tired, things like that. I want to be clear here as well, is that I don't think if you want your kid to be good at lifting or like exceptional at lifting, get a trainer. Okay. This is the same with like adults. Like, what I'm teaching you here is like how to train with your kids so that they stay safe and that they enjoy the process. Not necessarily like, I'm not trying to use this episode to create like kid trainers to every listener. I'm just trying to, if you want to involve them, how do we do so in like a safe and respectable manner? If you want to be like, well, I want to train them so that they're good at their like rep hockey league, get a trainer for that. Like, and there are people who specialize in kids, or people who specialize in athletes, which has a lot of kids, and you can go that route, but you don't need to go the route. You don't need to become like a trainer in your own right. This is just, So time is a big one. So for 30 seconds, as opposed to like 10 reps. In general, kids aren't good at rest periods at all. Like the only rest periods I would say is like go get them to drink some water between exercises. But that's basically it. If you're like, okay, we're going to take our 3-minute break now, it's not going to happen. They're not going to make 3 minutes. They're going to get distracted. It's going to happen almost always. And then keeping it simple as well. So you're not going to have it where like, if I'm teaching the 35-year-old mom how to goblet squat, and, I'm going to say things like, keep your upper body as upright as you can, keep your knees forward, hips back, look forward. Like this is already too many cues for kids. So you want to keep it simple. You want to keep, 1 to 2 things to focus on. Even 2 is kind of pushing it. You want to set an example for your own form. So that's a big thing as well. Don't train them for anything that you're not comfortable yourself. So like if you're not comfortable with the deadlift form, this is not a time to teach your kid deadlifting. Okay. This is not, you want to teach them things that you're comfortable with, and then going from there. So I think that's like super important. Keeping it simple, low rest periods, multiple exercises in a row tend to work well, especially if you're working with multiple kids. So if you find they get rowdy together, what you can do is have stations. So let's say you have 3 kids and you're all lifting together. The idea is that you would do 3 stations, and then they all switch between stations. And that means they don't, distract each other, which is good. And also like they're doing a lot of exercise, and it makes them like pretty tired. And also it's easier to manage. If you only have 1 kid, you can still do multiple exercises in a row. And, kids tend to enjoy that more than just like, okay, 10 squats, and then we take a break. And then we do 10 squats again, and then we're taking a break. It like doesn't tend to happen that way. I also want to be clear here. I'm talking about kids in general. Maybe your kid's different. This was my experience working with the number of kids that I worked with, that like we couldn't just like give them a program and tell them to go have fun. That was just like an unrealistic expectation, especially when they were in groups and with friends and things like that. So again, I kind of want to clarify, I'm not here, this is not going to be like full on training. This is really just so like, if when you're working out, can your kids join in a like safe and respectable manner? And then the answer to that is like, yes, but with like some caveats as well. Let me know if you have any questions about this, if you've heard any other myths that exist with kids. I know there's a lot, especially with parents, and I hope that if you train with your kid, that other parents aren't giving you a hard time about it. And if they do, you can send them my way, and I'll explain thoroughly how it works. But lifting's not unsafe. Should you do it? That's going to kind of depend, especially a lot on like if this is your own personal time or not. That's going to be the big one. And if you prefer it for it to be family time instead of personal alone time, then I say go for it. And then if you want it to be your own time, that's fine too. Kids don't have to lift if they don't want to. There are other things that they can do. I wouldn't say this is mandatory. I would recommend it, but I don't think it's like a mandatory thing they have to do. So that's my answer here. Let me know your thoughts and if you're going to lift with your kids. Again, I'm at strongwithmark@gmail.com or at Training Strong Women. But thanks for listening to another episode of Who's Lifting Today?